So the suffragists, the fight for the vote in Sullivan County. If we can get this to move now. There we go. So before we start the actual presentation, just a note on terminology. You often hear the term suffragist and suffragette used, and most often they're used interchangeably. They're not exactly the same thing. One Connecticut newspaper said that a suffragist is one who thinks about votes for women. A suffragette is one who gets out and works for it. That's not exactly accurate. I like the National Park Service definition better. The term suffragette was seen as an offensive term in the US. And in fact, the term suffragette did not even exist until about 1906 when it was coined by a newspaper in Great Britain. But from that point forward in the US, it was used to describe the more militant or the more aggressive faction of the battle for women's, for the women's vote. And a suffragist was a woman who was working within the system, let us say. So the Park Service says that the term suffragette was seen as an offensive term and not embraced by the suffrage movement. Instead, it was wielded by anti-suffragists in their fight to deny women in America the right to vote. But at any rate, they are two different terms. And some of you may know that throughout the struggle, there were different factions and different approaches taken to this fight. And even as late as the early 20th century, there was a split. And Alice Paul led the more aggressive faction of women, and probably would more rightly be considered a suffragette as opposed to a suffragist. So just to set the stage here, this map, I think, can put things in perspective. If we look here, this is a map that shows where things stood in terms of the 19th Amendment. So those light blue states that you see, largely in the West and New York State, a few others, women had full voting rights prior to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The gray states had full voting rights before, not just before the 19th Amendment, but before those states were even admitted to statehood. So as territories, they had passed the right to vote for women. The pale green vote, pale green states could vote for president before the 19th Amendment, and the gold ones did not have the right to vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment. So you can see that there was quite a lot of the country that had to wait until the 19th Amendment was passed before they got the right to vote. So I'd like to start out by talking about one of the unsung heroes, really, of the struggle, and that's Carrie Lane Chapman Catt. She was originally from Wisconsin, but much of the early work that she did in the 19th century to fight for women's suffrage was done in Iowa. But once her husband died, she moved to New York State. She became president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In fact, she was handpicked by Susan B. Anthony to succeed her in 1900 as the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And although her work is often associated with the state of Iowa, where she grew up and attended college, after the death of her second husband, she spent the last 32 years of her life based in New York, died at her home in New Rochelle. Under her leadership and what became known as her winning plan, by 1916, the group represented 2 million members. So that information comes to us from Susan Ingalls Lewis, who wrote Women Win the Right to Vote in New York State, which was a 2013 article that she published. But Carrie Chapman Catt was responsible for developing the strategy that eventually led to women winning the right to vote in New York State primarily, but elsewhere as well. And I just want to mention that what we'll be focusing on today is really the battle that took place leading up to the referendum in 1917 that was approved in New York State. Because once New York State women got the right to vote, the strategy had to shift, at least in terms of our local scene, because it was then up to the state legislatures to begin to ratify the amendment. Here's a philosophy from Carrie, Chapman. Everybody counts in applying democracy, and there will never be a true democracy until every responsible and law-abiding adult in it, without regard to race, sex, or creed, has his or her own inalienable and unpurchasable voice in government. And I think this was a philosophy that carried over to her creation of the League of Women Voters after the approval of the 19th Amendment. After it seemed as if the fight was won,
John Conway.
She continued the battle and realized that it was important to work with women to make sure that they responsibly used the vote. And the notion of this unpurchasable voice was the fact that they shouldn't be unduly influenced as neophyte voters. And I think she took that battle upon herself with the creation of the League of Women Voters. So primarily it's important to note that it was Carrie Chapman Catt's strategy, which became known as the winning plan, that really turned the tide. And we'll look now at the different kinds of strategies that were used. Some of you may not know that in 1915 in New York State, the referendum was voted down. We'll see in a moment about that and how the strategy had to shift. So in 1916, along comes Carrie Chapman Catt, and the new strategy is adopted, which leads to victory in 1917. Another quote from Carrie Chapman Catt. Remember that our country is fighting for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own government. Vote for women's suffrage because it is part of the struggle toward democracy. And again, this strategy took on a new life when the United States entered into World War I. And this was, you know, as tragic as that was, the World War, and certainly a dark part of our history with so many people being killed, but it served a purpose in that it enabled a lot of people to look at the struggle for women's suffrage in a different light. Here we are fighting on the other side of the world for people to enjoy freedom, democracy, and here at home, we're denying that right to a major segment of our population. So the entrance into World War I provided a new impetus for the women. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So locally, we don't know a lot about what happened here in the 19th century. And obviously, although many people trace the struggle for women's suffrage to its beginning in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention, we know that it actually began long before that, probably back as early as 1820 or so. And despite what we're being inundated with today in a lot of the media and a lot of the people who have kind of hijacked the women's struggle, there wasn't a large rift between African-American women and Caucasian women in the struggle. In fact, most of the early suffragists were abolitionists before they were suffragists, and they saw this as a struggle for all women, regardless of race, creed, or color, as you saw from the quote by Carrie Chapman Catt. But in Sullivan County, we don't know a lot about what was going on in the 19th century. There wasn't much written about it. I'm sure at some point, hopefully someone will have the time and energy to deep dive into that and come up with some information about what was going on here in those early days. But we can put together quite a bit of information about what was happening in the early 20th century. In fact, as we move into that second wave of struggle after the defeat of the referendum in New York State in 1915 and the adoption of the CAT plan, the winning plan, we see that virtually every community in the county, from Bloomingburg to Roscoe, creates an active women's suffrage club. So by 1917, there were 21 such clubs in Sullivan County, more than in any other county in the Assembly District in New York State. Most of those women, unfortunately, have been long forgotten by all but their descendants. And for many, even their given first names are difficult to ascertain. When Deborah and I were putting together this women's suffrage section, and we began to research some of these women, we realized that in almost all cases, in the style of the day, newspapers referred to these women only using their husbands' names, as in Mrs. C.W. Montgomery or Mrs. Luther Payne, Mrs. B.F. Green. Very few of the women, like Elizabeth Worth Muller, were known by their actual given names. So throughout the county, there were these clubs, and there were women in charge of the clubs and in charge of recruiting new women to the clubs. And this became the strategy, was to develop a grassroots effort to create support for women's suffrage. Now, obviously, the women themselves were not able to vote. It wasn't a matter of convincing women to vote, but it was convincing women and equipping them to convince the men in their lives, the men that they might come in contact with during the course of the day, and to go out and to convince men that to support this women's suffrage referendum that was coming up. Again, these women included Mrs. Luther Payne and Mrs. B.F. Green in Liberty, Mrs. Elizabeth Worth Muller and Miss Agnes Fairchild in Monticello, Mrs. Paul Johnston in Livingston Manor, Miss Leah Olcott, later Leah Olcott Stanton, and Mrs. C.W. Montgomery in Wurtsboro, and many, many others. As you see there, 21 clubs throughout Sullivan County. And I've even seen references in places to the fact that there were 22 clubs. So either or, 21 or 22 clubs throughout the county. Many communities in Sullivan County eventually had their own women's suffrage club. I want to focus on two women in particular who were active in the county in the fight for women's suffrage, and they were active at different times and in different ways. One of the earliest suffrage workers that we know of in the county was Elizabeth Worth Muller, shown in this picture with her daughters, Alma and Phyllis. Alma actually married Frank Wupperman, the actor who, when he moved to Hollywood, became known as Frank Morgan, and of course is best known, many of you have heard me speak about this before, best known for playing the Wizard in the 1939 movie, The Wizard of Oz. Here the women are pictured in 1914. So Elizabeth Worth Muller was the wife of a German immigrant, Rudolf Muller. They lived primarily in New York City. He made a fortune in the real estate industry, and they had a large estate on Long Island, and as some of you may know, they built what became known as Muellers Castle in Monticello, which was on a precipice known at that time as Egg Hill, which today overlooks Monticello Raceway. It's on what's known as Varnell Road in Monticello. And this was just torn down in 2007. It's really just kind of an elaborate Victorian house, but because of the turret, it was always known as Muellers Castle. And after Mrs. Muller moved to California, the castle was sold. It had a life as a resort, as a bungalow colony, and as I said, it was kind of an apartment house for a while, and fell into disrepair and was eventually torn down in 2007. But Mrs. Muller was at least as well known for owning the castle and for building the castle as she was as a suffragist. But Elizabeth Worth Muller is really a fascinating character. And in the years leading up to that 1915 referendum, she was, without a doubt, the leader of the suffrage movement in Sullivan County. And she enlisted her two daughters, Alma and Phyllis, in that struggle. And one of the most visible things they did was to create this this votes wagon, which you see here, votes for women, as you see on the banner, victory in 1915. And again, this is leading up to that initial referendum in 1915, which eventually is defeated. But they got this wagon, they hired a driver and a team of oxen. And by the way, interesting to note that the oxen are named Taft and Teddy. So you have one named for William Howard Taft and one named for Teddy Roosevelt. Elizabeth Worth Muller is the tall woman in the center of that picture. And they took this votes wagon around the county, making various stops, pre-scheduled stops and holding rallies. Because of the novelty, it got a lot of action, it got a lot of press. But Elizabeth Worth Muller was a very dynamic woman, and she was very accomplished. It did a lot more than just work for women's suffrage. She was a lawyer. She passed the bar exam, one of the first women to do that, certainly the first woman in Sullivan County, although she did not practice law. She was one of the first women in New York State to get a big game license and to shoot a deer. She did a lot of things in the name of advancing women's rights. Here's a picture of her with Calvin Coolidge at the White House. Elizabeth Worth Muller is the tall lady in the hat. I guess all the ladies are wearing hats, but she's visible over Calvin Coolidge's right shoulder. This is after Coolidge became president, obviously. So this is after the 19th Amendment was approved. But she had once been arrested for picketing the White House. And then obviously later at this point in time, she's a guest of President Coolidge. Here's another shot of the votes wagon. And what they would do is they would take this wagon around the county. They'd stop, let's say in Liberty, where they had a crowd would gather because of the novelty of the oxen-drawn wagon and the women aboard. And they would make their speeches and they would try to convince men to support the referendum that was coming up in November of 1915. And this was probably the most visible of Elizabeth Worth Muller's strategies. Here's a note from the June 1915 edition of the Liberty Register. Mrs. Elizabeth Worth Muller, former suffrage leader of Sullivan County and a resident of the county seat, made us a very pleasant call last Wednesday. Mrs. Muller wishes to congratulate the people of Liberty upon having Mrs. L.C. Payne, Mrs. Luther Payne, appointed suffrage leader in this county. Mrs. Muller is working hard at Monticello in the interest of suffrage, and a little later on will start again with her prize ox team, the unique campaign she conducted at her own expense last summer. Mrs. Muller is very optimistic relative to the vote for the suffrage amendment next November. Nonetheless, despite the efforts of Mrs. Muller and Mrs. Payne and others, on November 2nd of 1915, the proposed women's suffrage amendment to the New York State Constitution is defeated by a margin of almost 200,000 votes. This is New York State Constitution. This is a referendum in New York State. So it loses by close to 200,000 votes in New York State. In Sullivan County, it's voted down by 2,418 votes. It's interesting to note in these years, these crucial years leading up to the eventual ratification in 1917, how the local newspapers of the county approached the struggle. And some of them were obviously much more supportive than others. Just anecdotally, I haven't done a formal study of this, but in the research that I've done, which admittedly has been somewhat limited, it appears that there were a few newspapers that were quite vocal about supporting women's right to vote. The Hurleyville Sentinel, for example, was one of those papers that seemed to be solidly behind, and they devoted quite a bit of coverage to the suffrage issue. And another paper that seemed to be supportive was the Sullivan County Record, which was published in Jeffersonville. There were other papers that seemed a bit more begrudging in their coverage. I think the Liberty Register was one of those. You rarely saw a coverage of the women in the Register. And again, that's just anecdotally. I haven't done a lot of research into it, but it's interesting to note the way the different papers treated the issue. And by the way, that was not unusual. If we look at any particular event, for example, as we begin to, if you research the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, you would see the same thing. Different papers in the county covered it in different ways. Some papers barely mentioned it at all. The Republican Watchman, for example, gave and the Register gave very little coverage to the epidemic of 1918, while other papers like the Sullivan County Record seemed to devote much more coverage to it. So the women's suffrage issue was typical in that regard. But after the defeat of the referendum in 1915, along comes the winning plan, which is developed by Carrie, Chapman, Cat, and the strategy shifts a little bit. And the winning plan, as I said earlier, involves a grassroots effort. It involves setting up these clubs in every single community and getting women out to work in each community to convince the men in that community to support this referendum that will again be on the ballot in 1917. So the strategy changes with the defeat of the referendum in 1915, and a new strategy is put in place, and there are new leaders. So Elizabeth Worth Muller is kind of, she takes a back seat now. She kind of steps back. Obviously, her efforts with the oxen-drawn votes wagon, as much notoriety as that got, were not successful. And so we see new women coming to the forefront. And the woman who takes over in Sullivan County is Bella Montgomery. And Bella Montgomery is a woman that we spent a lot of time researching, Deborah and I, over the last few months. And for the longest time, we could not even determine her first name. In almost every single newspaper article, and there were lots of them, that we found mentioning her, she was always referred to as Mrs. C.W. Montgomery. And I think that's a very important thing to note. In dozens of articles in numerous newspapers of the day, she was always referred to as Mrs. C.W. Montgomery. Only in an obituary for her husband in November of 1929, in the Scarsdale Inquirer, which, by the way, was a newspaper that she helped to found in Scarsdale, was her first name, Bella, mentioned. It took us months of research, diligent research, to find her first name. She was the daughter of Charles D. and Isabel Inman of Wurtsboro, both of whom died in 1917, which was ironically also the year of her greatest triumph. She leads the fight, a successful fight for the approval of the referendum. Her father was a Civil War veteran who had served for a time as president or mayor of the village of Wurtsboro. He was also water commissioner there and was on the board of trustees for the Wurtsboro School. And of course, this was before centralization. Mrs. Montgomery lived much of her life in Scarsdale, where she raised a son, Vern, who later attended Hamilton College. She found the time to help the Women's Club of Scarsdale start the Scarsdale Inquirer, a weekly newspaper, in 1919, and to serve as president of the local chapter of the League of Women Voters in 1926. But in Sullivan County, at least, her greatest claim to fame is that she was the leader of the suffrage movement leading up to the 1917 referendum. She served multiple terms as the president of the Sullivan County Assembly District of the New York State Women's Suffrage Party, and in that position hosted many notable suffragists from around the country, including Margaret Foley and Helen Todd. And these were two nationally known speakers who would travel around the country to excite people about the issue of women's suffrage. So when they would come to Sullivan County, for example, it would be Mrs. Montgomery's role to take them around to different meetings and to introduce them to people. She did this from one end of Sullivan County to the other. For example, on Saturday night, July 28th, 1917, she was, Mrs. Montgomery was the featured speaker at a rally hosted by the Wurtsboro Suffrage Club at the home of Mr. and Mrs. C.W. Drew in the village. The Sullivan County Record newspaper reported that her speech was so compelling that each man, with a single exception, not only donated money, but with his contribution gave a promise to vote yes on the suffrage amendment on November 6th. And these kinds of things were taking place throughout the county. On Sunday, October 28th, 1917, as the clock is ticking toward the November referendum, Mrs. Montgomery made arrangements for Helen Todd, who was here from California, in a last-ditch effort to secure victory for the women's suffrage amendment in New York's November election, to speak to church congregations in Callicoon, Fremont Center, and Hankins. So on one Sunday morning and afternoon, she went to 3 different congregations and spoke about women's suffrage. And then over the next week, she remained in Sullivan County, and Mrs. Montgomery took her around to meetings in Monticello on October 31st, Woodville, Tanana Lake, Roscoe, and Rockland on November 1st, to Grooville, DeBruce, Willowemock, and Livingston Manor on November 2nd, Bradley, Neversink, Claryville, and Eureka on November 3rd, and then on November 5th in Liberty. And the vote, of course, was on November 6th. And it was through efforts like this that they were able to get over that hump of about 2,500 votes in Sullivan County. But Mrs. Montgomery was the leader of that effort. Certainly not alone, though. There were women in each one of the communities that took on this mantle of leading the fight in that community for suffrage. Here's an article from the Liberty Register, March 31st, 1916, that talks about the early effort in this new strategy. A suffrage club has been organized in Wurtsboro under the inspiration of Mrs. C.W. Montgomery, who is suffrage chairman for the 27th Congressional District. Miss Margaret Casper is president of the new Wurtsboro Equal Suffrage Club. Mrs. C.E. Downey is vice president and Mrs. Washburn secretary. There are 7 or 8 active suffrage clubs now in Sullivan County, and they seem to be pursuing a quiet campaign of education with unabated energy. So this is a tiny little article that appears in the Liberty Register. Here's a July 13th, 1917 article from the Register. Liberty is the goal of SUFs on July 17th. The 9th District Notables on Convention program to be presented in Memorial Hall. So this is about a meeting that was put together by Mrs. Luther Payne, Dr. Payne's wife in Liberty. Mrs. Luther Payne and her committee on arrangements have made every effort to ensure a successful convention when the Sullivan County branch of the New York State Women's Suffrage Party meets here in Memorial Hall on Tuesday, July 17th. The committee will extend the hospitality of Liberty to the delegates and visitors from every corner of the county, and to the officers of the state and district organizations who will speak. A large attendance is expected as suffrage enthusiasm in Sullivan seems to be growing due to a changed attitude toward women's service caused by the war, and also to the efficient work of Miss Alida Brooks of Orange County. State suffrage organizers who have brought the number of suffrage clubs in Sullivan up to 21, the largest number of such clubs in any assembly district in the 9th district. Mrs. C.W. Montgomery of Wurtsboro, suffrage leader of Sullivan County, will preside at the convention. She's working tirelessly for the vote. So this talks a little bit about that change in strategy, the change in attitude that came about as a result of our entry into World War I, and talks a little bit about the energy that is evident among the women. Here's a follow-up to that in the Liberty Register on July 20th. Suffrage workers score at convention. When delegates from the 22 suffrage party clubs of this county met in Memorial Hall on Tuesday of this week, they constituted a pretty thorough representation of Sullivan County's women. The earlier article, you will note, mentioned 21 clubs. This article says 22. During the business session, clubs of Summitville, Wurtsboro, Woodridge, Mountaindale, Hurleyville, Livingston Manor, Roscoe, Jeffersonville, Long Eddy, Grahamsville, Eldred, Coshocton, Bethel, Monticello, and Liberty gave in their reports, which revealed, among other things, the fact that over 150 of the county women had taken part in the state military census work. Election of officers resulted as follows. And each one of these women obviously was involved in the fight for the vote in their community. Mrs. C.W. Montgomery, Wurtsboro. Mrs. M.L. Cobell, Roscoe. Mrs. Paul Johnston, Livingston Manor. Mrs. Charles Newkirk, Wurtsboro. Mrs. Luther Payne, Liberty. Miss Agnes Fairchild, Monticello. Miss B.F. Green, Liberty. Mrs. J.W. Barnes, Bloomingburg. Mrs. Frank A. Vanderlip, the campaign district chairman, who is also a member of Mr. Hoover's National Food Conservation Committee, gave a most interesting and instructive address on organization and women's work in wartime. An ingenious design for women's overdress known as Hooveralls was displayed. At the close, Mrs. Vanderlip presented the county suffrage treasury with a substantial check and offered 3 prizes to the 3 women who would secure the greatest number of enrollments before the August convention at Saratoga. So this is coverage of the Women's Sullivan County Convention in Liberty, and a lot of the women who are involved in suffrage are mentioned in this article. Again, the Sullivan County Record was one of those papers that seemed to be more or less in favor of suffrage, and here's an example. As you can see, don't worry about trying to read this article because I'm going to show you an enlarged version of it in just a moment, but you can see that they devote a front page coverage to the suffrage rallies that are taking place in Western Sullivan County as we get into August of 1917. But again, front page coverage on the Sullivan County Record. Here's that article, Suffrage Rallies Today in Western Sullivan. And this is talking about Margaret Foley, who's a very well-known national figure in the struggle for the vote for women, coming to Sullivan County and speaking. Today is the big day for suffrage in Western Sullivan, as 3 rally meetings are to be held at different places under the auspices of the local suffrage clubs. The first meeting will be at North Branch at 3 p.m., the second at Union Park, Jeffersonville at 7, and the third at Callicoon at 8:30 p.m. The principal speaker at these meetings will be Miss Margaret Foley, a suffrage orator of nationwide reputation, who will talk upon the subject patriotism and suffrage. And again, now we can see the link that they're drawing once again between the U.S. entry into World War I, and the issue of suffrage. Miss Margaret Foley is well known all over the country as a suffrage speaker, being a unique figure in the women's suffrage movement of America. There is only one Margaret Foley, her friends say. She is logical, forceful, and witty, and a remarkable carrying voice, according to those who have heard her, holds her audience in rapt interest to the last word. Miss Foley's early years were devoted to the study of music and swimming. She's an expert swimmer, and it was while teaching swimming and gymnastics at Western Coast resorts that she first began to become interested in civic betterment. Soon after, she became an ardent worker for suffrage and has been speaking for the cause ever since. And it goes on to talk about how she will be guided through the county by Mrs. C.W. Montgomery of Wurtsboro, Sullivan County Assembly District Leader, and also Miss Alida Brooks, who was from Orange County, but devoted a lot of time to the struggle here in Sullivan County as they wind down to the referendum in November. This is Margaret Foley on the right. As I said, very well known nationally. Here's an article that appeared in the Hurleyville Sentinel on September 5th. Miss Margaret Foley, an interesting and forceful speaker, will deliver an address on equal suffrage in Hurleyville this Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock and at Liberty in the evening. Everybody is invited to hear Miss Foley speak on this topic of vital interest, which will be voted on at the coming election. Here's another article from October from the Hurleyville Sentinel. Miss Montgomery, notice how she's referred to here as Miss Montgomery. Obviously, she's Mrs. Montgomery. Organizer of the suffrage clubs of Sullivan County, gave a very able address in Fred Lawrence's hall last Friday evening. This was Lawrence's Casino in Hurleyville on Main Street, which was enjoyed by those present. The following day, Miss Brooks, Alida Brooks from Orange County, assisted by Mrs. Will Prince and Mrs. Minnie Knapp, made a canvass of the town, distributing literature and checking off names of the voters who were or were not in favor of suffrage. They were greatly pleased with the result, 2/3 of the men interviewed being in favor of suffrage. The Women's Political Club met at the home of Mrs. L.H. Prince on Monday afternoon to further plans for the coming election. So they're about a month away here, and obviously they're stepping up their efforts. This is an article from the Liberty Register around that same time, October 12th of 1917, as now Mrs. Frank Vanderlip, wife of the well-known financier, comes to the county to speak. And again, she's taken around the county by Mrs. C.W. Montgomery or Bella Montgomery. Mrs. Vanderlip heads all the suffrage activities of the 4 counties in the area: Rockland, Orange, Westchester, and Sullivan. She's member of the Federal Women's Liberty Loan Committee, appointed by the Secretary of the Treasury. She's also Secretary of the New York Federal Reserve District. She's one of the first women in the state to wear the Hoover uniform and to put into active operation in her own home the Hoover system of savings, et cetera, et cetera. So she comes to Sullivan County to speak in favor of the vote. Miss M. Louise Grant, one of the best known and most popular of the suffrage speakers in this campaign, is speaking in Sullivan County this week as follows. Coshecton Friday evening, October 12th, Lake Huntington Saturday afternoon, October 13th, Narrowsburg Saturday evening, and Sunday services morning, afternoon, and evening at Barryville, Ulen, and Eldred. So no matter how small the community, these women are making sure that they address groups there and carry the fight to the furthest reaches, not just concentrating on Monticello and Liberty and the more populated areas, but getting down into the trenches and conducting this grassroots campaign. The Hurleyville Sentinel again from October 18th. The Sullivan branch of the state suffrage party is carrying on an active campaign in many parts of the county. Miss Louise Grant, popular speaker, has been touring in the upper end of the county. Miss Montgomery announces that Miss Helen Todd will tour Sullivan County the last 2 weeks before Election Day. Miss Montgomery says, everybody look for a decorated car with Miss Todd and Mrs. Montgomery. Suffrage is coming, and so are they. Miss Todd shows whereof she speaks, as she comes from a state where women have voted for some time. County names to appear in big suffrage parade. So one of the final gestures by the women as the November referendum approaches is to have a huge parade in New York City. And the signatures of over 6,500 women from Sullivan County were part of that. The Sullivan County women did not participate in the parade, but their signatures were part of the placards carried by the women. The signatures of 6,597 women from Sullivan County, it was announced recently from suffrage headquarters, will be one of the many interesting features of the coming big suffrage parade in New York City on Saturday, October 27th, when 50,000 are expected to march in the proposed women's suffrage demonstration. Mrs. C.W. Montgomery, suffrage leader for this district, announced that the work of pasting the individual signatures from this county on beaver boards is now being carried out in New York, and that when these boards are completed for the parade on October 27th, the voters of New York State will have an opportunity of seeing the actual names of 1,012,407 women in the Empire State who are petitioning for the voice in the affairs of their own government. So this was the huge parade, October 25th article in the Sullivan County Record. And here's a New York Times photograph of the parade from October 28th, 1970. As you can see, the women are carrying these placards with these signatures affixed. One of the interesting things about the battle for the vote in 1917 was the change of heart that President Woodrow Wilson had. And we'll never know, I suppose, what impact that had on the vote. But he had been staunchly against the women's right to vote until 1916 or so. And in October of 1917, he actually had published in newspapers throughout the country this letter under the White House letterhead, where he expresses his support for women's suffrage. And this was a big turnaround for Wilson. Again, we don't know exactly what impact that had, but it certainly helped to some extent. Here's the text of that. Men of New York State, you are as fair-minded as the president. You know that the 1,012,994 women of New York who asked to vote are women of of every locality, of every representative type, your mothers, wives, and daughters. You know that 2 years ago, the vote for women's suffrage in this state was the largest ever cast in favor of a constitutional amendment. It still lost. You know that if 1 man out of 9 had changed his mind and votes for it this year, women's suffrage will be a fact. Since 1915, the war has shown what women's service to the state can mean. The military census counted women and men alike in estimating the resources of New York, and lists the state's full strength by voting for women's suffrage. So this was an ad on October 26, 1917. Just a couple of days before the vote, suffrage workers' closing campaign, Great Drive Through County, ends in Liberty. Next Monday evening is the parade. The signatures of 6,500 Sullivan County women carried up Fifth Avenue, et cetera, et cetera. And again, Mrs. Montgomery prominently mentioned in this article, but again, no mention of her first name. Here's an article after the election, and of course, in the November 1917 election, the referendum is approved. The Liberty Register had this little entry in their November 9th edition. Town votes for women, agrees with rest of state that they deserve the ballot. However, it lost in Sullivan County. The Village of Liberty gave women's suffrage a plurality of 16, thereby taking a place in the sun with the rest of New York State, which gave women the vote by a plurality of 94,000. A splendid campaign the suffrage workers carried into every corner of the Empire State, turned the adverse vote of 194,000 the women received 2 years ago into this year's victory. Although Sullivan County as a whole rejected suffrage, so in 1915 it lost in Sullivan County by around 2,500 votes. In 1917 it loses again, this time by even more, 3,735 to 3,314. So more than 400 votes. The women, I'm sorry, not as many as before, but 400 votes it loses in the county. The women carried Fallsburg 422 to 367, Highland 120 to 86, Liberty 528 to 512, Lumberland 85 to 69, Rockland 413 to 392, and Thompson 451 to 441. 6 out of the 15 towns. They failed to carry a town in 1915. So you can see that 6 of the Sullivan County's 15 towns supported suffrage, but overall it loses in the county. This is the photo, by the way, that we chose for the cover of the women's suffrage supplement that the Sullivan County Democrat published last Tuesday. This is a woman named Leah Olcott, later Leah Olcott Stanton from Wurtsboro, posing with the flag. She was one of the suffrage leaders in Wurtsboro. So that is my presentation.